Spotify listener. Are you looking for a spark that could ignite new opportunities? Earn your degree on...
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robbie Samantha Roy, Vice President of Technology and Innovation at Lockheed Martin Corporation and a SciTech 2016 Executive Steering Committee member.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the first day of the conference. Certainly was a great day to get all of us mingled together and talk about some of the leading technologies, and we're now kicking off on day 2. So welcome to day 2 of SciTech 2016. It turns out that there are nearly 4,000 of our colleagues from across the US and around the world that are here in San Diego this week, and I hope you've taken the time to reconnect with old friends and colleagues, as well as the time to meet new people and build the networks that will help us collectively shape the future of aerospace. Let me take this opportunity to thank the sponsors of AIAA SciTech 2016 that you see on the screen behind me. Without their generous support, we could not bring you this forum. We have 3 quick housekeeping items. Number 1, whether you are here in San Diego or watching on live stream, we are using the conference's I/O site for speaker questions during plenary and Forum 360 sessions. The URL is aiaa.cnf.io. And there you can submit questions and read the speaker bios. More information and instructions are available in your programs. 2, we are having a Twitter contest this week, so remember to use hashtag AIAA SciTech in your tweets. There are some great prizes. Look for details in the program and on the Twitter boards around the hotel. And finally, please note the following plenary session we will have afterwards. We'll have some reminders about the rest of the day, so please stay with us. After the conclusion of our panel, there'll be a few further announcements. So without further ado, let's talk about this very interesting panel this morning. Today's panel is a multi-generational panel consisting of both Apollo-era aerospace innovators and those that have either recently joined or are about to join the aerospace workforce. The purpose of this panel is to discuss knowledge sharing across the multi-generational workforce and to share innovative approaches to solving complex problems. While there are similarities and differences between the Apollo era and today, both from budgetary as well as from geostrategic political considerations, both groups can learn from each other and can share lessons learned and approaches to developing and integrating disruptive technologies. Moderating this panel is Dr. Mason Peck, the Associate Professor at the Sibley School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Cornell University. And most recently, most of us know that Mason was NASA's Chief Technology. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peck and this morning's panel.
Thank you, Robbie, and good morning. We do have an extraordinary opportunity here to talk about innovation. And it's innovation not only in the sense of knowledge sharing, it's innovation because of what at least my thesis is, what I see going on in the aerospace community today. Unlike, as far as I can tell, the decades that preceded us, we have seen here since 2010, maybe a little bit earlier, an extraordinary shift. Not just toward commercial space, although there's been that shift, not just toward small startups in space, which really was not a thing a decade ago, but also toward a spirit of innovation that I think most accurately recalls the Apollo era in my limited perspective. So I thought it'd be good to get these kinds of folks together, innovators from this next or upcoming generation, and innovators from the Apollo era, all of whom have had long careers, or maybe are about to have long careers, but in any case, at the moment, represent these two arguably different perspectives, but who share a passion for innovation and an experience in a world where paradigms are breaking and the world is changing. Speaking of that, you'll see that participation website, the AIAA.cnf.io website. That's the means by which people online watching via live stream can offer questions. It's also true for you here in the audience. So if you have some kind of device, please go ahead and go to that website. You can ask a question that way. It's a little more efficient than passing around a microphone. However, if you're of my generation and find it rude to be texting in front of people, you can also raise your hand and we'll try to get a mic to you at some point when you have a question. For now, though, the idea is this. We'll start by my introducing each of our four panelists with a very quick biography that does not do them justice. And then I'll go to each in turn and ask them for a few minutes of opening remarks on this general question, the question of how do we innovate? How do we break paradigms? How do we show the courage that aerospace has always been about? So let me start with Zach Manchester. Zach is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. He's probably best known as the developer of the first crowd-funded spacecraft, the 3U CubeSat, known as KickSat-1, which was funded via Kickstarter and launched 100 little spacecraft of its own, a so-called spacecraft on a chip, in April 2014. KickSat-2 is expected to launch this spring. His research interests include dynamics, controls, applied mathematics, robotics, and physics with spaceflight applications. He received his PhD in 2014 from Cornell University. Mary Pope is the Delegate Certified Product Engineer for the Orion Crew Module, Propulsion System Pressurization Components. Among many activities, she's responsible for pressure regulators and helium pressurization valves. And although she's been with Lockheed Martin for only a little over a year, she's already successfully brought to completion a high-profile failure investigation on a leaking Engineering Flight Test 1 regulator in time to support EM1 hardware build-in schedule. She was also previously a bioengineer with Siva Therapeutics and is a 2011 graduate of Lehigh University. Hans Mark is former Secretary of the Air Force, the 7th Director of the National Reconnaissance Office, former Director of NASA Ames Research Center, and a former Deputy Administrator of NASA, which is enough for at least 4 careers. He's taught and continues to teach aerospace engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. He has a PhD from MIT, and he's the recipient of awards far too numerous to mention here, but, you know, Wikipedia's at your fingertips, so learn all you can. William Anders, Bill Anders is a former U.S. Air Force officer, nuclear engineer, NASA astronaut, the first chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, former ambassador to Norway, and former general manager of the GE Aircraft Equipment Division, and he retired as chair of General Dynamics. Once again, 5 or 6 careers worth of effort there. In 1963, Bill joined NASA, where he served as the backup pilot for the Gemini 11 mission. Then in December 1968, he flew as lunar module pilot for the Apollo 8 mission, the first mission where humans traveled beyond low Earth orbit. And as an aside, we find ourselves here again with Orion and future plans at NASA, once again reaching out beyond low Earth orbit. And this may be a topic we discuss. What are the prospects now, 40, 50 years on, for doing this, not just the same, but even more than we had originally done in the 60s? Bill took a celebrated photograph of Earthrise that I think if you're thinking of that picture with the moon, the Earth in the background, I know you are, that was his picture. He served as backup command module pilot for the Apollo 11 mission before accepting an assignment as executive secretary with the National Aeronautics and Space Council. He has a Master of Science degree in nuclear engineering from the U.S. Air Force Institute of Technology. So that is, again, a quick and unjustly short summary of this extraordinary panel. Let me start with Zach and ask you for just a few minutes of introductory comments.
Well, first I'd like to just say that it's an incredible honor to be included in such company up here. I obviously, as Mason said, come from kind of the small sat world and was involved in this KickSat project a few years ago where we sought to deploy over 100 of these very tiny, almost quarter-sized spacecraft in low Earth orbit. So I feel like I can speak mostly to this kind of where are we headed perspective and some of my experience in this area. So I think 2 big themes that I see being very important for continued innovation in aerospace going forward. One is the availability of very low cost, very capable electronics. And what I see happening there, on KickSat, for example, we were able to build all of the avionics in the spacecraft for under $1,000 using the sort of parts that are typically in your smartphone, for example. And this is enabling, as Mason mentioned earlier, things like small satellite startups. Now it's possible for Silicon Valley startups to deploy spacecraft constellations. You're also seeing this in the development of low-cost commercial UAVs and these things becoming available to the hobbyist market in ways that were not possible previously. The other major development that I see being important going forward is the availability of low-cost online collaboration tools and the availability of both open-source hardware and software. KickSat, we took advantage of things like the Arduino platform, open source hardware, open source software to make use of things like IMU designs, for example, that are available on GitHub. These sort of things where you can take existing hardware that people have developed and decided to share in an open manner and customize it to your own needs. It leads to much faster development cycles and the availability for small teams to innovate on a level that I think was previously impossible. So I think combining these trends, I see far more possibility for small teams, for startups, for hobbyists to get involved in space and things like unmanned aircraft in ways that were previously impossible. So I think that's kind of it for me.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, I think that the idea of democratization of space, of accessibility to space, not only in the sense of launch, but also more broadly for the many of us who've been inspired by the past decades of success in space. And that's a direction that it's exciting to think of going. So, Mary, a few minutes of opening comments.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate it. It's an incredible honor. So I work for Lockheed Martin on the Orion space program, and that is NASA's new human-rated space program developed for deep space exploration. And so I work in the propulsion group, and I do, like Mason said, I have a bunch of different responsibilities, but one of my recent responsibilities is working with our international counterparts. So this is a joint program with the European Space Agency, and you were asking of how do we keep innovating and how do we encourage new programs and new exploration. And I think having international partnerships is really important to increase the longevity of programs. We saw it worked with the International Space Station, and I think that it's going to provide huge value to the Orion program that we are partnered with the European Space Agency for this program. In addition, I grew up watching both of my parents who worked in aerospace throughout the shuttle years, and that really inspired me. And so I had a firsthand experience of constantly knowing what was going on in the space world. But I know that a lot of kids in my generation growing up didn't have that kind of experience. And I think with the way everyone is so connected now, and with social media, and the way that people could live stream the Orion EFT-1 test launch last December, I think that is really starting to pick up and inspire a next generation, because seeing what people are doing in aerospace is so accessible. And so everyone knows. It's really easy to find out what is actually happening, and I think that is also really important, because I think the only way to keep innovating is to inspire our next generations of young engineers and scientists, and letting them know, letting them know what is actually happening out in the aerospace world is a key way to do that.
These are great points, and let me just ask, if you don't mind, a slightly personal question. You had been working as a bioengineer, and then finally decided to follow, to some extent, your parents' footsteps working at Lockheed. Can you say something about how you made that choice? What inspired you to go into aerospace?
Sure. So I was actually able to watch the last space shuttle launch in 2011. And as I was standing there with my family and I watched it take off and go into space, it was the most amazing, impressive thing I had ever seen. And so that stuck in my mind. And I had graduated just recently with a bioengineer degree, and I wanted to give it a go. But then I started learning about the Orion program, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. No one's ever done this before. No one's ever sent people to deep space or to Mars. I want to be a part of that. And so it just kind of worked out that way.
Thank you. Hans, a few opening remarks. I think we talked about this ahead of time, since you could, and also Bill, you could probably spend the next 4 hours telling us things. Let's try to, we'll say on the order of 10 minutes if you are willing to do that for us.
Okay, don't be afraid, I'll be short. I'm here to represent the airplane community, and what I thought I would do is to just give you a few minutes of talk about the picture that you see on the screen. The topic, of course, is the tilt-rotor airplane, and the first one that was built was in 1950. Robert Lichten was the innovator there, and you can see the airplane can fly. It's off the ground, but it could never convert to horizontal flight because it was too flimsy, and people were afraid that it would come apart in the air. But that was the first effort. The second was one that was started in 1960, the XV-3. That was an Army program. And you see that airplane hovering in front of the NASA Ames airplane hangar. This picture was taken in 1967. The aircraft was actually built in 1960, and we built 2 of them. And these airplanes had an engine you see in the middle of the fuselage, and then they had a system to get the power to the wingtips, where you could tilt the propellers. We lost 1 airplane during the test period, but we did learn how to go from horizontal to vertical flight and back again. And we did about 100 conversions in the test program, which was quite successful. But the airplane could not do anything. It weighed 3,000 pounds gross weight, and the engine had 750 horsepower, P&W radial engine. But we proved the concept that such an airplane can work. The next step was the XV-15 in 1977. That picture was taken on its first flight. The difference between that one and the XV-3 is that the engines, as you can see, are on the wingtips, because the power to weight ratio is much better on a turbine engine than on a reciprocating engine. The airplane was, we signed the contract with Bell in 72. First flight was 77. And then we also lost one of the airplanes in these, in the test program. Nobody got hurt, I should say, because the airplanes were pretty close to the ground when they failed. But the program was canceled at the end of the Vietnamese War because the airplane was initially designed to be a medevac, medicine evacuation. The airplane in the middle, of course, is the most important one. That's the Osprey, and that is a follow-on from the XV-15. I could say a lot about this airplane. We now have a couple of hundred of them, by the way, and they're deployed by the Navy. You've all seen that. But I'll wait for the question period to get into more detail. The last picture is 2003, and that is the first commercial tilt rotor that was built. The industrial process was pretty complicated. It started with Bell and Boeing, and then Boeing quit, and Bell made a deal with Augusta, the Italian aircraft builder, and Bell finally pulled out. So this is now the WA609. W stands for Westland, the British company, and A is still Augusta. But I have a feeling that this airplane is going to have very interesting commercial applications. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. Bill.
Well, when I was asked to do this here not long ago, I jumped at the chance, mainly, in all due respect to the others,
Sure.
because my mentor and friend, Hans Mark, was going to be on the panel, and I sat at his knee for decades. And in my view, he's one of the more undersung leaders, researchers, educators, patriots that this nation has had. So Hans, my hat's off to you.
Thank you.
Was asked earlier this morning, what's happened to our space program since Apollo? Why can't we have the support that we've had? So I thought I would give a little history lesson going back into the 50s and 60s and talk about the main motivation of Apollo, which was not exploration. It was to beat the Russians. We were most of you weren't even born probably, or were toddlers at the time. But we had the missile gap, mutual assured destruction, Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN saying we're going to bury you. We were embarrassed time and time again by the Soviet Union with Sputnik, Laika, Gagarin, and the American public was really putting the heat on Eisenhower and then Kennedy to show the rest of the world that really capitalism in the United States were indeed the leaders of the world and not the Soviet Union. So that was really the basis of Apollo. As my colleague on Apollo 8 has said, Frank Borman, Apollo was just another battle in the Cold War. It really wasn't to explore the moon, though that was one of the fine benefits that fell out of it. Also developed a lot of technology. Hans and I were talking about the computing capacity today. Apollo had less computing capacity than this watch I have on my wrist. And this is synchronized with Boulder. I don't know that, that Apollo was. But anyway, the problem was that when Neil and Buzz stuck the flag in the moon, the race was over. Nixon allowed a couple of more. He was almost ready to cancel 15 and whatnot, but NASA talked him into keeping going. But eventually, Apollo was terminated, and NASA was at a loss to know what to do next. Well, one thing about Apollo is that the pieces of it were very strategically paced around the country. The centers, the community, the support contractors, everybody was depending on NASA for a lot of jobs, and it was Nixon's upcoming election, and he was depending on it, particularly in Southern California, for a lot of votes. And so I recommend that you read John Logsdon, the book After Apollo, which in full disclosure, our little Anders Foundation helped fund, gives an excellent discussion of how Apollo how Apollo ended and how the shuttle started and basically why it went off the track. I remember being up in the White House as an appointee running a thing called the Aeronautics and Space Council, and the big push was to come up with a follow-on to Apollo. In looking at Mary's picture or somebody's picture of the, what do you call it?
It's the Orion crew.
Orion, I thought I'd seen that before. And one of the candidates that was pushed by Wernher von Braun was an upgraded Saturn, a digitized Saturn, and a big command module. Unfortunately, that didn't produce enough jobs for the Nixon administration, and NASA was pushing a reusable vehicle. Sounded like it made a lot of sense. Why throw it away like the Saturn was? Why not have one that you could use again? And so they calculated and convinced me that they could reduce the cost of orbit by a factor of 10. And I can remember after a presentation in the Indian Treaty Room by me and NASA, making that point. And when I got back to my office, I was called by Ehrlichman. He said, Bill, which was one of the Watergate guys, if you might remember, for those old enough. Bill, which one of those would provide the most jobs in Southern California? And I said, well, you don't have to be an aerospace engineer to know that the bigger the program, the bigger the jobs. And without me catching my breath, he said, that'll be the one. And then, so Nixon and Fletcher shook hands. Fletcher forgot to ask Nixon for the $600 million contingency, which hobbled, the development. But NASA started off. They had the option. Others were saying they should have done a small one first to test it out. But oh no, NASA knew how to do things, hadn't they landed on the moon? Well, as time went on, to make a long story short, the shuttle turned out to be a very delicate vehicle. It was a research vehicle. It never got out of the research stage. As you know, it had several accidents. And instead of launching, once a week for everybody, including the Air Force, it was lucky to get 2 launches a year. So not only did it not decrease the cost of orbit by a factor of 10, it roughly increased it by a factor of 10. That's a 100-fold error. And NASA didn't have the guts to cancel it when it became obvious that it wasn't cutting the mustard. Had they done it maybe back at Columbia or somewhere, we wouldn't be in this sorry situation we are today with no real backup capability. We have to hitchhike rides with the Russians in order to get to, I guess, our space station. It's not clear who owns it anymore. We're scrambling around trying to do an Orion. There's questions about whether, that's what NASA really ought to be doing. And so I would say that the shuttle, and I know this won't make some of you happy, but I think it was probably one of the bigger policy mistakes that this nation has made in space. And the message here is don't bite off more than you can chew. It's good to reach out, but if you reach too far, you'll fall on your face. And you also, I think, who was it? The Gambler's song, you got to know when to hold them and you got to know when to fold them. Kenny Rogers or Danny, yeah. That's another one, keep in mind. If your program, is showing signs of being unsupportable, admit it. Now, the problem with NASA is they've still got these people depending on them. So they have to come up with something that keeps everybody employed. And of course, now you have congressional districts writing Congress staffers, writing specs for spacecraft. I mean, it's really sad. And we didn't have to do that in Apollo. And today, besides getting a lot more oversight and a lot more risk averse, you have to, you don't have the Cold War imperative to get the public behind you. So I think I've said enough. I gave that talk to the Association of Space Explorers here a couple of months ago. It actually went over pretty well, and they called it the skunk at the garden party.
Thank you. There's certainly a lot to follow up on here. We've got about 10 questions that have been submitted, whether from online or from people in the audience. I appreciate those. We'll get to those very quickly. And again, if there's someone here who's like to ask a question and can't manage the electronic devices, let us know. We'll come up with a way of getting a microphone to you. Let me just start with one or two follow-ups from your opening statements. The Cold War as a context for Apollo. A lot's been written about it. I think we roughly understand that that's the motivation for much of what we call the space race, and it wasn't necessarily for the sake of science or for the sake of some starry-eyed optimistic exploration ideal, but rather to show that we were the best militarily. There were other applications of space at the time. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory, which was declassified not too long ago, was one of those. That was the prospect of sending people into space to take pictures of the surface of the Earth, like a U-2 in space or something. That went away thanks to electronics. We got better at taking pictures robotically, and we didn't need people to do that. In 1945, there was an article by Arthur C. Clarke in Wireless World, a famous article in which he proposed a geosynchronous communications satellite. A lot of that had been talked about before. He speculated, maybe you would take a few kilowatts of power. Maybe we could use these new fancy photovoltaics to make this whole satellite thing work. He got a lot of it right, including that you needed about 3 to cover the Earth. What he didn't get right was he assumed people would be on board those spacecraft to man them, he would have said. To provide them with the human agency necessary to run a TV station or radio station in orbit. So what we once thought made sense for human space turned out not to make sense. One of those, I guess we can call them dichotomies, that people like to bring up is that a lot of what we could do with humans, we could also do robotically. I happen to believe it's not an either-or proposition, that there are things we learn by sending people into space, things we can do, whether it's for science's sake or the sake of military applications. Also true for robotics. We don't have to go one way or the other. But as time goes on and technology advances, and Zach brought this point up, we learn more and more about what's possible using technologies from other fields. So one of the questions we have here is, how do you stay relevant with changing times when there are leaps? And there it goes. Okay. When there are leaps in technology that are happening so quickly. The way I would try to pose this question to you is, because these days technology is changing so quickly, is it even possible for us to take on a long-term vision, given that maybe 5, 10 years on, technology will be so different that we would wish we had done it another way? I'm not sure how even to answer that question, but that's why you smart people are here and why I get to ask the question. Why don't I start with Zach, see if you have a take on this, and we'll move down the row.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think the solution to that problem is largely in kind of the second theme I was trying to talk about in my introductory remarks. Part of the great advance in technology and software that we're seeing right now are better tools for collaborating and iterating on designs more quickly. So now there are CAD tools with collaboration features, software development tools with collaboration features. It's now possible, I think, to iterate on designs much more quickly. There's rapid prototyping technologies that allow you to make mechanical devices much more quickly. So I think many of the while the technologies themselves are evolving, so are our abilities to take advantage of newer technologies more quickly and iterate on our designs more quickly and generally innovate faster. So I think somewhere in there's kind of a nexus of these two that meet up that will allow us, I think, to take advantage of many of these newer technologies and incorporate them more quickly as they come about.
So Mary, in your position, you're working on, I guess you could call it a large-scale aerospace system. There are a few larger in the civil space world, at least. How do you approach, or how have you been thinking about, since you're only there for a year now, how do you start thinking about the change, the improvements that might be possible? Is better the enemy of good enough, as they say? Do we stick with the plan and pursue it all the way to completion, even if a better idea comes along in a program of the scale, complexity, and length of Orion?
I think it really depends on the technology. So I think that for a lot of the hardware pieces, they're very similar. They've been the same for a number of years. I think for an example, that Lockheed Martin is working on learning to use additive manufacturing for several aerospace components. And so that's a new technology that we're trying to incorporate. And safety is our #1 concern, especially when you're sending astronauts into space. And so it takes a lot of upfront time and resources for testing just to make sure the new technology, it doesn't have, there's no heritage with it, right? So you have to gather all of the data upfront and fresh, and that just it's a lot of upfront impact. But where it makes sense that it's going to pay off in the long run, I know Lockheed Martin for the Orion program is putting that effort in.
I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question, but in a company like Lockheed who's had a storied history of success in aerospace, a lot of that success might lead to conservatism. Do you find that within the Orion program you're able to innovate? Is that something that's possible given your relatively junior position in the program?
Yes, I definitely think innovation is something that we're always open to. So the Orion program is a blended team of NASA and primarily Lockheed Martin team members. And so it's not just Lockheed Martin that's conservative. NASA itself is very conservative from the failures that they've seen across their different programs. And also, going back to sending human astronauts into space, human life is very important, and so that is really where their conservatism stems from. But innovation is something that we're always open to. We're always, in my team meetings, we're always talking about new ways, new ideas, anything that we think is a really great idea that we'd like to try to incorporate on the program. We're always open to hear those ideas, and then there are a select number of them that get brought along further.
Thank you. So Hans, this question of innovation in the context of rapidly changing technology. Now think of your tilt rotor examples, that AW609, I take it was started as a civil tilt rotor based on a commercial airframe. I'm not sure how it evolved since then, but I suppose each generation of these tilt rotors has depended to a great extent on what came before, but also new technologies have been inserted as they go along. Has there been something disruptive, would you say? And does that disruptive change cause us even to question whether it's possible to make these things successful programs?
Well, it took a long time to reach the point where a couple of airplanes were necessary for fighting wars, the Osprey. And the technology development in the tilt rotor business was slow. It started in 1950, and now it's 65 years later, and we're just doing the first commercial airplane. I would suggest that what's fast is not the airframe. The equations on which that thing is based were invented by Bernoulli and other people, 200 years ago. What's fast is the electronics, the instruments you need to use the airplanes, and that changes very, very rapidly. And it's kind of interesting that in the space part of our program, we're talking about the rapid things, but you can talk about rockets, and rockets are old also. So the question from the aviation point of view is, what's new in aircraft? And of course, the drone, the airplanes that you can now fly without having people on them, illustrates what I've just said, that the Global Hawk runs on the old equations, but the stuff to make it work and to use it depends on the rapidly developing technology that you folks talked about.
Now, Hans, am I even right in thinking that both for space and for air, there was a sort of spirit of the age in the 50s or 60s that it somehow brought innovation to the fore? I get the sense that one of the reasons that NASA was successful and developed the reputation it did in that time was these were the only folks who could have put someone on the moon. There was not an aerospace industry as it exists now that might be able to commercially take on some of the challenges. Was that true for aircraft? Did you find that at that time people thought differently about aircraft?
At the end of the Second World War, there was a very, very rapid application of what we learned in World War II, and of course that these airplanes that we built then were very rapidly converted to commercial uses, and of course the tankers, the KC-135 is the best example of that. That was the prototype for the 707. I mean, that was the first large transport airplane. So you're quite right. That is, the 1950s and the 1960s had this could do these things because of things that were done during the war. You know, we could have never funded, say, a jet airplane if it hadn't been for the tankers, because the tankers gave us the millions of flight hours you need for the FAA to certify the airplane.
Thank you. Bill, what do you think about technology changing rapidly these days? Was that the sense that you had during Apollo? Were things changing so quickly that it was, the ground was shifting under you folks?
Well, let me start by saying that, you know, that is a dilemma, because the technology cycle is a lot shorter than the congressional budget cycle.
That's right.
And the oversight today given by the various committees is extreme. You know, they're worrying about the taxpayers' dollars, and they want to have guarantees from NASA. So NASA has to lard on safety and make promises that are, you know, will undoubtedly get undercut by changing technology. Going back in history, and Hans knows more about this than I do, but besides the Cold War, the United States was blessed with a thing called the NACA, the National Committee on Aeronautics and Astronautics. And when I went to Washington for the National Aeronautics Space Council, I was trying to put aeronautics back into our aerospace program.
Right.
And it had been, you know, NASA was built right out of NACA. And the focus was on manned spaceflight. Okay, a little bit of reconnaissance and Landsat and Viking and stuff to keep the scientists happy. But the real effort was beat the commies.
Yeah.
And so I think it may be time when you have, you know, guys like Bezos and Musk jumping up, waving and pointing to the moon and doing rather spectacular things. It might be time to for NASA, I think, to maybe not try to be the spacecraft developer, in all due respect to their partnership with Lockheed Martin, and step back more into an NACA type role. Let's catch our breath. Let's not get panicked about beating the Chinese to Mars. Give private enterprise a chance to do this kind of stuff. Help them rather than stand in the way. Be safety FAA type inspectors. But let NASA go back and start doing the really hard stuff, like a nuclear rocket engine. I'm a nuclear guy. You're not going to make it to Mars quick enough without a nuclear rocket, in my view. Come up with the long-term effects of weightlessness and space radiation, which NASA's kind of swept under the rug, in my view. And get NASA out of, in the manned program anyway, the prime development. You know, let's catch our breath for 20 years and see what happens. I don't think we have to worry about beating the Chinese. And ask ourselves if NASA doesn't need a new role in the future. More like the NACA of space.
Now, as you know, I mean, NASA has been moving in that direction in many ways. And there's some in Congress that support that, some that don't. You yourself, you talked about the fact that there's a lot of congressional interest in ensuring jobs flow from NASA money. And that is part of what they do. You know, there has not been universal support for NASA's commercial orbital transportation efforts. How much autonomy would you think NASA should have if, again, as you say, it has virtually none right now? It's essentially driven by congressional priorities through the appropriations process, and to some extent by OMB, the White House, right? On its own, as an agency, do you foresee a NASA with the independence to make these kinds of decisions?
I'd
programs?
hate to have Charlie Bolden's job. I think, you know, he's basically treading water as directed.
Right.
And, but, you know, people are still screaming to get to Mars in 10 years and build things like this Orion, which I'm not sure what it'll do. Maybe it will take a lot of money and not do all that much. There's some that have made that claim. It's going to be tough to get the congressmen who have to get votes from Huntsville and, you know, Mr. Shelby's staff and others to not get into the spacecraft design business where they are.
So let me go to some of these questions here, or some more of them, I should say. One of the most highly voted questions is, what are the most important skills for aerospace professionals to foster early in their careers? And I would ask you, if I can, as moderator, to think about this question in the context of innovation. If we agree that the innovation economy is almost the new Cold War, that is to say, we are in an economic conflict with countries now in a way that maybe we were in a military conflict 60, 70 years ago. If you think it's economics, if you think if it's economic competitiveness that could drive what we do, what are some important skills for aerospace professionals to foster earlier in their careers? Who would like to try to take that one?
Well, since I'm a classroom teacher, or have been now for 25 years, maybe I can try to answer. Look, the most important thing for people that go into our business is to really thoroughly understand the basics. That is, you know, where the things we need to do our jobs came from. And so I start with that, but that has very little to do with innovation. Let me tell you a story. You all know who Michael Dell is. He's one of the leading citizens of Austin, Texas. He has a lot of money. He is the son of a very well-regarded medical doctor in Austin. And when I got to Austin, I was chancellor of the university. And Dr. Dell called me up and said, I have a son who is 19 years old, and he's now starting his sophomore year, and he came to me the other day and said, I want to quit school. And so he then said, I want you to talk to him, because maybe you as chancellor can persuade my son to stay in school. So I agreed, of course, and Michael showed up in my office, you know, coat and tie and very, you know, good looking and nice. And so I started to talk to him, and you know, I told him, I said, you know, it's really important for you to get to know all these things that we as engineers and as scientists use. And he kept saying, yeah, but I have this idea about computers, and that, you know, the computer is one of these things that's very easy to change. That is, I want to build computers that fit the customer completely. And you can do that with a computer because you can change it easily. You can actually ask the customer what he wants and get it for him. And I have to tell you, I didn't quite understand what he was talking about. So, you know, finally he said, well, I'll take your advice and think about it and all that. the upshot of all of this is I should have given him $100 when he walked out of my office door. But look, innovation is something that is rare. There are not many people who really know how to do innovation. And I've worked and met people, and I think one of the things you have to be able to do is to recognize innovators. As you can see, I didn't recognize Michael Dell, but I don't think you can make real innovation happen by willpower alone. I think you have to look around and look at the people that have that knack of thinking about new things. That would be my answer to you.
In my own attempt to innovate within the format of a panel, I'm going to try this. Zach, could you ask a question of Bill Anders? You get the moderated question.
Okay. Well, I really love hearing your stories about Apollo. I'm particularly interested in, you mentioned earlier, we need nuclear rockets to go to Mars. I'm familiar with the NERVA program. I'm sure many people here are. Could you speak to maybe where you see that going, and what are the barriers preventing that from happening? Why didn't we have that 40 years ago? And a history lesson on that, I would love to hear something like that.
Well, nuclear rockets suffer from the same problem as nuclear power. Not in my backyard. It's hard to get a plutonium thermal generator launched. It has to go through all kinds of review because everybody knows that nuclear is bad. And so even though I spout off about a NERVA or something, I'm not sure I'd have the constitution to be the program manager. One of the things that Nixon did to me, which I never liked him for, is he made me first chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And that's got to be one of the most frustrating jobs I ever had, because you're supposed to at least appear to be neutral. So I'd be up there listening to the utility execs saying how great their power plants were and don't worry about the fault and all that kind of thing. And then hear the concerned scientist, a group of 2 or something like that, bad-mouthing it and tangling nuclear in its underwear. And I finally just, when my term was up, I said, that's it. So I think it's going to be very hard to do a nuclear rocket. Certainly, I don't think you can lift it off from the ground. You're going to have to assemble it in space. And yet the times involved, even though people are going to talk about shielding and whatnot, I just don't see it. And so that's why I think these ideas of going to Mars in the next 10 years or even the next 20 years are dreaming. And but of course that's what all old guys say, except maybe Hans. He's more innovative than I. But getting to the innovation question, I think innovators, in my experience, are generally the oddballs. You look around in your research group, and if there's some guy, or gal who, just seems strange, they're more of the chance of being innovators. And what the rest of them really need to do is be applicators. How to recognize innovative technology that somebody else has done and then apply it to your system and hopefully have bosses that'll let you do that. I don't know if I dodged your question or not there.
Thank you.
I'm going to try another one. So Mary, you're up. Can you think of something you'd like to ask an Apollo-era former director of the NRO, Ames deputy director of NASA, Hans Mark? You got a question for him?
So earlier it was discussed that maybe NASA should take a different role and not develop their own programs like the Orion program. Maybe it was they should play a role where they're more of an overseer. How far do you think the commercial space companies right now can take their technology? I mean, do you see them successfully taking humans into space in the next decade or so? I mean, would you be comfortable putting astronauts on the technology? I'm curious to hear your opinions on the companies in the commercial space front right now.
Well, I guess I have to reveal my old-fashioned thinking. I've got a lot of students now that work at SpaceX, and they invite me to come and talk to them. And we have a SpaceX unit in near Waco, Texas. That's their rocket stands, the rocket things, and then we are building SpaceX, not me. SpaceX is building a launch site for bigger rockets in Brownsville, just off Brownsville. And with all due respect, I see little difference between SpaceX and NASA in terms of where they get their funding, because 85% of the money that SpaceX gets comes from NASA. Now, Bill mentioned something very important. SpaceX doesn't have to go to the Congress. And so that's the real difference, that they have a freedom of motion that NASA really doesn't have. That would be the answer to the question. I think that in terms of what the so-called private company, I remind you, Boeing is a private company too, okay? But they spend a lot more money. SpaceX is still a small spender compared to the big aerospace companies. And so they have fewer troubles with politics. They have private money. That's what private is, but the technology is the same.
Could I add something there?
Yeah.
I think if the airline industry had been embraced by NACA the way NASA is embracing, the Launch Alliance, and I don't really consider that free enterprise. I mean, Norm Augustine, good buddy of mine, but it's talk about a military-industrial complex.
That's right.
There is one.
Yeah.
And so had the airlines been embraced like that, I don't think nutty guys like Howard Hughes and TWA and Juan Tripp, most of whom failed,
That's right.
lost their own money. If Elon is, quote, dumb enough to put his own money in it, well, good, let him do it. And so far he seems to have been making some good calls.
Yep. And
that's my comment about kind of stepping out of the way. Don't do the stuff that they could do. NASA needs to be the safety regulator if astronauts are going to fly. Unfortunately, the value of life by the Congress is infinite. And so therefore you have to have infinite safety, and therefore you will never get there. So I think a lot of it has to be volunteered, come up from the bottom, get the government out of the way.
To your point, the old saying is, the best way to become a millionaire in aerospace is to start as a billionaire, right? So we have only a few minutes left. Let me tell you what the top-rated question is from the audience here and the folks watching on the live stream. And it has to do exactly with this. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson are not here, nor are their representatives. I'm not sure that we know that. Is there anybody here in the audience from SpaceX, Blue Origin? Okay, see, so I think that's not quite a fair statement. But also, I will point out that they're not listed among the sponsors up here. And also, I haven't really heard that they sponsor aerospace R&D the way that Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and other major aerospace primes do. Maybe this is a matter of maturity. Maybe over the years they will, I guess I could say, come into the fold or be more active participants in this community of research, as well as, again, for the space conference. But let me ask it this way. Do you expect a change in the way that these startup space companies work, or is this the new norm? Will there be a large number of small companies all competing, not really engaged in the larger conversation that we all have among the Boeings, Lockheeds, and Northrop Grummans, and Orbital Sciences, and other primes of the world? That's my way of asking the most highly rated question here. Anyone would like to take that?
I'll take a crack at it. So I think in the software development world, you have several large companies. You have Microsoft, you have Amazon, but who do fund academic research and this sort of thing. And you also have an entire world of small startups that are very nimble and maybe don't get involved in conferences such as this. So I think it's an extremely healthy way to do things, and you see many of these small companies in the technology sector get acquired by the larger companies and bring innovative ideas in. And I think if something like that can be fostered in the aerospace world, which hasn't had anything like that, I think previously, that would be extremely healthy and a very good way to foster more innovation.
Any other comments on how you expect these startups to be part of the community in the future?
Well, having run a couple of big companies, I can tell you that our R&D was a strong function of our sales to the government.
Right.
So you don't want to pat the big companies on the backside too hard, because R&D is a function of sales, and that's great. That's what, that's how the government pays these people to do R&D. And since SpaceX and others aren't getting big government contracts, then they don't have the resources to do that. And they're feeding off the innovation and the lack of constraint that is applied to NASA. So I'm probably one of the few guys here that got stood up for lunch by Elon when he found out I thought going to the moon or Mars in 3 years or 20 years was kind of silly. I didn't realize that he was stimulating his troops because they were going to be the ones to go with him. But I must say, I've been impressed with what they and the other private enterprise people are doing, and I would hope that NASA could find a way to kind of get out of the way and not, pour too much money down a rat hole that could have been done back in upgrading the Saturn V.
Well, I appreciate your time, all you panelists. Thank you very much for your engagement in these questions. I hope that the audience who found this a useful conversation across a couple of generations. I remain the starry-eyed optimist, believing that as great as the achievements of the Apollo era were, the best is yet to come. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.